welcome to Tales of Our Times. This is a show where we discuss the stories that move us, what makes them so meaningful, and why others could or should find meaning in them as well. This is not a spoiler-free show, so bear that in mind as you continue to listen. We tackle books, movies, podcasts, and more. Where there's a story, there's a reason to read. I'm your host, Amanda Stevens, and this is another special Takes of Our Time episode, which means it's another special format episode. No guests this time, just me, and we'll be covering some of the theory that we've dropped here and there on our show, especially some of those that are particularly important, but we just don't have time to get into them in our regular episodes. Right up front, our spoiler warning does still apply. It's not a spoiler-free show, but I'm going to be doing my best to avoid some of the biggest spoilers here and there. We'll mostly be talking about things that happen kind of early on in a story or are very evident from the premise of a story. So just kind of bear that in mind. And today's topic is tropes. Now, if you listen to my show, you might be familiar with the idea of tropes. If you're not, don't worry. That's what we're covering today. So hopefully you'll have a good working idea of what they are by the end of this. But tropes as a topic is actually a really large and difficult to cover idea in just one show. So it's likely that this will be a recurring theme from time to time that we come back and visit. Today, since it's our very first one, what we're going to be doing is covering what tropes are through words that kind of helped me to finally understand what they are, and hopefully that will give you a good working definition. And then we're going to go over some tropes that are just kind of good to know across a variety of genres. These are tropes that are good signposting or that you probably hear come up in conversation. I've also had a few of these suggested to me by listeners as things that they wanted covered. I'll try to call those out as we get to it. It's about 50-50 between what I think are very good ones to know and what our listeners submitted. However, if you ever have any ideas, kind of a little reminder of things you'd like covered on one of these talks, or even if you just have a story that you would like to be talked about, remember that you can always shoot me a message. I'm here. I'm looking at your emails. That email that you can send me is stephea@rti.org.taiwan. You can also find that on my profile page on RTI's website. So that's just a little reminder for you. And without further ado, let's get into it. What is a trope? Now, if you Google what trope is, and this is kind of, I think, where a lot of us start, you see what I think is a pretty unhelpful definition for kind of like a layman or somebody who's not necessarily like working in writing or filmography or something like that. And it's often told as a storytelling device that communicates something to the audience, or a recurring motif. And those are both true. That is exactly what a trope is. But a working definition, something that kind of helped me realize what a trope is that tropes are a lot like patterns that we see repeated in stories many times. Those patterns could be a character type, a place, an object, a personality trait. There's so many different things that could qualify as a trope, but it's a pattern that we see so often that we've given it a special name. Tropes often have meaning to them, some of it that we understand up front, and some of it that is tied to cultural beliefs or just like patterns that we've seen in other stories. So I don't want to get too bogged down in the theory. I want to kind of just jump straight to examples. One of my favorite places to find examples is actually in fairy tales, because in my mind, I think it's a lot like having tropes knit together to form a story. Some really famous tropes are the handsome prince, true love's kiss, and the magic three. Now, in a lot of stories, we come to expect these ideas, and that's certainly true in fairy tales. And the reason we expect them is because they help us to understand things about each character and also about the story, like how long each story will go. For example, in most stories, in most fairy tales, the handsome prince can be assumed to be a good guy. Now, in modern stories, we play with that and people like to turn it on its head, but somebody who's a handsome prince is often going to be a hero. For something a little bit more complicated, there's the example of the magic three. So what does that mean? To dig into it a little bit. To talk about the magic three, it's easier to think about examples. So in fairy tales, for example, how many little pigs are there? How many billy goats gruff are there? How many times will they say, on my chinny chin chin, let me in, let me in, let me in? So it's usually 3 times. But we also see this in modern storytelling as well. So think about in a horror movie, how many times is it going to take to start the car? How many times is this person going to call their lover, trying to get a hold of them before they get on the plane, only for it to finally go through? Or how many times somebody's going to try something before it actually works? In almost all of these answers, the answer is the 3rd time. It happens that 3rd time, almost as if by luck or providence or something else. Now, we kind of recognize this in stories to the point that it's almost become blind, but I would challenge you the next time that you watch this story, keep an eye out for the magic 3. It kind of pops up everywhere. Another kind of famous trope that's not this one, but that you see is at the end of a movie or a story when a mentor or the hero tells us that the real prize all along, or the real power to save everything, was love. I think everyone can come up with at least one example of either of those two. They're very popular ideas to the point that actually some of them have become cliches, which brings me to my next point. All of the tropes that I've set up until this point are so well known that we see almost all of them as cliche. So just to kind of get this out of the way, does that mean that all tropes are cliches, or are they inherently good or bad? The answer is no. Tropes are not good. They're not bad. They're just patterns that we use in stories, and they're like tools, right? So it's not the trope, it's not the pattern itself that's good or bad, but it's the way in which it's used. Tropes are ways in which writers can give us information about characters, and they're also ways that we as readers or watchers understand stories, right? So by themselves, they're not good or bad, and they're not cliche. They're just a tool that can be used for stories, right? So summing it up, what are tropes? Tropes are patterns that we see in stories, often so much so that we have a special name for them, and we can kind of expect certain things by just knowing about a trope. Again, going back to Magic 3, once you know it, once you start to see it, you can start to expect when something is going to change, right? When the evil stepmother is finally going to get Snow White to eat that poison apple. So let's move on to some specific tropes. And we're going to talk about just a few little examples. I have 3 tropes here and something else that's very much connected to them towards the end, but not exactly a trope. And kind of hopefully by the end of this, these examples combined with what we said at the beginning will help you to have a good working idea of what that word trope means, as well as some really common ways that you might see them used in different stories around you. So to be clear, all of the tropes that I'm talking about in today's stories are used in every kind of storytelling that you have seen. I've seen them in video games. I've heard them in podcasts. They're in movies. They're in manga. They're in Western comics, books. Anywhere that you see a story, you can probably see these tropes. Now, also, they all have a funny name. So I assure you they can be used outside of the context of their name. And it's going to be important with these first 2 immediately. So getting into tropes that are good to know, the first one on my list is a trope called a kick the dog moment. So please relax. It's not necessarily kicking a dog. What does that even mean? A kick the dog moment is when a character in a story does something that is just kind of mean or cruel or over the top for no real reason. Or maybe they have a reason, but like they're not getting anything out of it. It doesn't help them get closer to what they want to do. It's usually a tool by the author or the director so that we know this person is a bad person and we should not feel bad for them and we shouldn't want them to succeed in the story. So it's kind of used to help establish villains. Some examples that I like to think of, one of them is in Disney's Mulan, when the villain Shan Yu captures a pair of Chinese scouts at the very beginning, and he gives them a message, or he lets them go back to their emperor because he wants them to tell the emperor that the Mongols are coming, that he is coming. As they both run away, he looks to someone next to him and he says the famous line, "How many men does it take to deliver a message?" As his guy nocks an arrow, says just 1, and we know that they have killed the other messenger. Now, what does Shan Yu get out of doing this? Nothing. It doesn't help him to get any closer to what he's doing, doesn't help him deliver the message. He doesn't gain anything by doing this. He's just doing it to be mean and cruel, which is why it qualifies as a kick the dog moment. But it doesn't even have to just be one moment. Another example that I really like is in the Harry Potter series, and it actually is something that plays out over the whole series. That's anytime that Snape is mean to Neville Longbottom. Snape is mean to everybody in general, but we can find reasons why he's mean to them. So like to Harry, he's mean because he doesn't like his dad, but he seems to particularly pick on Neville for not a lot of good reason other than for us to understand Snape is not a good person and that this is kind of one of his defining characteristics of just being mean and being a bully. So that's the first one. The second one is fun because it's kind of almost the direct opposite trope. It has two different names. When I went looking for some more diverse examples of it online, I found it under the name the pet the dog trope. But when I first learned about it myself, I learned it under the name a save the cat moment. So first of all, these are the same idea. They're the same thing that happens. And it's kind of the opposite of a kick the dog moment. So the idea is, in modern times now, the idea comes from where you show a hero or protagonist of a story stopping to save a cat stuck in a tree just as we're getting to know them. And now we, the audience, can immediately identify them as a good person, a hero, or at least somebody that we know has a good heart, and we should kind of be on their side, right? They've saved the cat. It also, though, can be used on characters who are antagonistic or kind of villainous as a way to show us that they're not all bad or they're still human. So it's a little bit more nuanced than the last one. So we've got two examples here. The first one is from The Hunger Games. So a little spoiler. In the first book of The Hunger Games, Katniss partners up with a little girl, she's only 12, named Rue, who dies. And Katniss really treated her very well, and she gave her a burial. And because of this, Thresh has a save the cat moment where he spares Katniss's life as payback for helping Rue. And in a heroic callback from the beginning of the movie Pacific Rim, right as we're kind of introduced to this idea that these giant mech robots are going to be fighting enormous kaiju. One of those first battles, a little fishing boat is caught in a fight between the kaiju and one of these big mechs. We know who to root for because the mech reaches down and gets the boat out of the way before they start fighting. And it's save the cat moment. In this case, a save the boat moment. So that way we know who the good guy is. We know that from here on out, we're going to be rooting for the mechs. That's the second one, a fun little pair of tropes that go well together. And the last trope we're going to be talking about today is a listener-submitted one called The Chosen One. Now, this is a fun trope. It kind of explains itself. The Chosen One is a hero that has been singled out by a higher power. That power could be God, gods, plural, destiny, something big and meaningful. And they are usually the only one who can do blah, blah, blah. Oftentimes, it's to save the world, but it could also be things like slay the monster, bring peace to the land, and so on and so forth. One of the keys to this character type is that they are special for something that they will do, something that they have the potential to do. Very rarely is it based on like their previous work, so to speak. It's kind of like you are the child of legend and we know that you will do great things. You just haven't done them yet, and that's why you're special. So one reason why I like to talk about this as well is because I think this trope has a lot of variations to it that are fun to look at. So some just off the cuff are when it is multiple people, the chosen people. Sometimes it's flipped on its head where the chosen one is someone who has the power to end the world as we know it and we have to stop them. And sometimes it's just a straight evil version of this, like the Antichrist, where a lot of the same chosen one stuff happens, but oops, it's all evil. Now, examples of this one could be found all over in basically every genre you can imagine. Some big names that came to my mind were Moana from the Disney movie. She struggles with being the chosen one, but she does ultimately accept her fate and kind of live up to her destiny. In the TV show Supernatural, Sam Winchester is eventually revealed to be a chosen one of the series because of his connection with Lucifer. There's some more details about that in a previous show I did with Michelle Chang. And of course, in video games, you're often put in the shoes of the chosen one. So your player character is the chosen one. Not always, but a couple of examples are Assassin's Creed, Desmond Miles. In Skyrim, the Dragonborn protagonist, Aloy from Horizon Zero Dawn, and of course, Link from basically every Legend of Zelda series. So that's just a few examples of that trope as well. Now, the last thing that I wanted to cover, like I said, isn't quite a trope by itself. It's a little bit bigger. And this gets back to when I was talking about different combinations of tropes, something called the hero's journey. Now, the hero's journey is a story archetype. That is to say, a pattern that defines a type of story we like to read. And I did actually talk about this as well in my very first Star Wars episode with Tyler Golek. Now, the hero's journey has 3 larger parts and around 12 exact steps. So I'm actually going to leave that to you to look up if you're interested in each one. But you can recognize a hero's journey in a lot of different, very similar stories. For example, we see one in a combination I like. Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and the original Star Wars trilogies are all a type of hero's journey. They have similar story beats in really different settings that play out in surprisingly similar ways. But the reason I wanted to talk about it today is because I feel like it is often presented as the only archetype in a lot of popular stories, and even sometimes called the monomyth, which drives me crazy because it's just not true. There are a lot of different stories to tell, a lot of different archetypes, and a couple that I wanted to highlight here are stories like The Rags to Riches. You know them, you love them. It's a story of a poor, destitute character rising in wealth and importance. Sometimes there's a moral, sometimes there's not. And sometimes a hero's journey gets written into it, but it's not important to that story. Some examples of Rags to Riches are Aladdin and even Ratatouille. Another famous story archetype that is not the hero's journey is the tragedy. We don't love it, but you probably know it. It's where a character is ruined by a character flaw or something more sinister, such as fate or an unfair system. One of the most important things about this, though, is that there is no heroic win at the end, and the story often ends with the character failing to complete their goal if they don't die entirely. Famous examples, of course, include Romeo and Juliet and A Tale of Two Cities, but also Grave of the Fireflies and The Great Gatsby, which are all qualified to be tragedies in their own right. So, story archetypes usually contain a lot of different tropes, and they usually have their own kind of tropey images. But I want to mention the hero's journey here because it is something that we have talked about on the show, definitely. But I also want to take a minute to, nip in the bud the fact that this is how all stories go. It is a way that many stories go, but it's not the only way we tell stories. And that's all we have time for on today's Takes of Our Time. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed digging a little deeper into some of these tropes and patterns that you can see around us. So, again, a quick summary. A trope is a pattern that you can see in stories many times. That pattern could be a character or a character personality or a place or something else. Some of the tropes that we talked about today were the magic 3, kick the dog moment, a save the cat moment, and the chosen one. So I would encourage you the next time that you're out to look for these tropes, see where you can see them and what they tell you about the story. I'd also like to end with a special announcement that Tales of Our Time is now on Spotify. And not just Spotify, but also Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. All of our shows from the very beginning, back to when we were 15 minutes, all the way up to this one, are now there. So please give it a listen, a share, and a follow. And if it's possible, give us a rate or review. This is really only possible because of your listenership. So from me to you, thank you so much. We'll be back next week with one of our regular format episodes. So from Radio Taiwan International, I've been your host, Amanda Stevens, and I'll see you next time.